Thank you so much for coming. It is wonderful to be here, wonderful to see your beautiful faces. We are going to have a very spontaneous conversation up here. We've imposed just the lightest organization over it. Our spur is the issue of what is imagination, what triggers imagination. The people who introduced us talked about imagination will take you everywhere. And I want to put stress on the you. It isn't really the authors and illustrators who are taking you. It's the reader who decides to mine the offerings that the illustrators and authors have given you to go off in your own direction. And we all really know this because when we talk to each other about our favorite books, we're not all saying the same things. We see different things in the books. We bring to our books our own understanding of life and of ourselves, our own needs and hopes and dreams, and we create with that. Still, we have some responsibility in trying to give you something that you can mine. Up here, you have 4 people who have approached this issue. 2 of us are both illustrators and writers, and 2 of us are strictly writers. We're going to start with our illustrators because we're going to try to move a little bit, I hope, from the visual into the linguistic, from the purely visual to the real language, the mix of the two, and then to the full language with Peter and me at the end. We're going to start with Nafisa, who is an illustrator writer, and then move to Prashant, who is an illustrator writer, and then to Peter, who works in fantasy, and then if there's anything left to say, to me. And with Nafisa, the reason we're starting with her, Nafisa, you do something very interesting in some of your work, and that is that you make very stark contrasts in your illustrations by using white and black. And I wondered if you wanted to start from that point or any other point.
So the work that I do it's double-pronged. One is my client-based work. And for the books that I've drawn for my clients or the publishing houses that have approached me have been for young readers, so it's in color, it's vibrant. My personal work, as you mentioned, is in black and white. The thing is, all my work is drawn very deeply from reality. I like drawing the world as I see it and experience it around me, both for my client pieces as well as my own work. But in my own personal work, the way I write and draw comes from how I interact with a particular space or a particular experience, what I feel, what leaves a strong enough impression on me. I draw in immense detail, and I write very, very empathetically, because it's the emotion of empathy that I find most fascinating, because I find it as a big connector between my readers and the people who receive my art and myself. I truly believe that an image is worth 1,000 words, definitely. But when an image is married with those words, it forms an extremely powerful connection between the writer or the artist and those who are receiving it, or who are receptive to it. And with children's literature in particular, what fascinates me is their power of imagination, their ability to take what I draw and create a whole different world with it in their head. You know, they take, it breaks geography, it breaks reality. They take an image I give them and create a whole universe with it. And I suppose that's the sort of fascination of children's book illustration for me.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, and Prashant, you make use of the entire palette, the whole rainbow in your work.
Yeah.
So,
For me, part of what my practice is is a lot of observational stuff. I've been a visual journal keeper for about 25 years. And so there's a lot of documentative work that I do where I go places, look at things, sketch nature, people, old buildings, all of these kinds of things feed my work and my imagination. But when it comes to children's book and the stories that come out of it, somewhere along the way, these observational drawings and reportage gets distilled into a very imaginative world. But for instance, in 2012, I was part of a National Geographic documentary in Madhya Pradesh, in central India. And the director wanted to show the region through the eyes of an artist and asked if I would be the artist. And I was introduced for the first time in my life, tigers in the wild in the national parks there, and indigenous communities who were so beautiful in going to Bhimbetka, which had 20,000-year-old cave paintings. I mean, these were their stories from 20,000 years or more in India, which I hadn't seen before. And then I was documenting these through my paintings and drawings and my sketchbooks, but they triggered the imagination for a book that I did with my friend Kalpana called The Case of the Missing Tiger Cub, which we set in Bandhavgarh and introduced very subtly without being too preachy. I did encounter tiger cubs by the reclining statue of Vishnu in the forest. I mean, there were little magical happenings that happened during my time there. I happened to, early one morning at sunrise, we set out and our guide said there are pug marks. There should be tiger cubs in the hills, and we made our way to the hills. And there was a BBC team there waiting for the arrival of these tiger cubs, and nothing happened. And they left in a huff carrying their fancy camera. And I stepped up 3 steps, and 3 tiger cubs walked out out of the forest next to the 10th century reclining statue of Vishnu. So I was like, we have to incorporate this in our storybook, right? I mean, it was one of the most magical things, but it actually happened. And so when it comes to triggering imagination or triggering these stories, for me, a lot is based on experiences that have happened to me that are profoundly magical. And when I put them out in comic books or storybooks, a lot of people don't realize that these things have actually happened to me because they feel like they're quite fantastical. But anyway, yeah, so that seems to be grounded in a reality, but then gets quite fantastical at times. Yeah.
okay. Peter, this is interesting. Nafisa and Prashant both talked very much about the effect of what they observed in reality on themselves. Nafisa talked about empathizing, being inside whatever she was observing. Prashant talked about experiences that profoundly touched him. One of the things that I like to tell new writers is that when you want to tell a scene, you should walk around it, look at it from every perspective until you find a perspective that makes your heart really go beating so hard. That is, you must care about what you're writing about. You must care about it desperately in order to have a chance of making your reader care about it. The involvement of the creator of the spur for your story, the involvement is essential. Now we turn to Peter, who creates worlds and isn't in those worlds, but I bet you're involved.
Thank you. I am. To what extent, it's always very hard to tell. Because my book, the Train to Impossible Places series, are all about a very ordinary, middle-class, sensible, level-headed girl called Susie who gets whisked away from her house by a magical train that comes roaring through in the middle of one night. Is this on? Yeah, okay. And it's very much about being taken out of the ordinary everyday life, because she's a rationalist, Susie, as well. She wants to be a physicist when she grows up. All of her worldview is based on logic and things making sense, and she thinks she's got the world pinned down and understands how it works and her place in it. And until one night, this completely impossible thing comes along and turns that worldview completely on its head. And so she stows away on board the train and goes on a journey with it in an attempt to understand it so that she can reclaim her understanding of the wider world, because the world is suddenly much bigger and weirder than she ever imagined it could be. And so she visits a whole succession of worlds along the way. And I don't know, I am involved in the sense that it's very much drawn from the tradition of reading that I grew up with, because the very first stories I remember being told were at bedtime. My mother read Enid Blyton's The Magic Faraway Tree stories to me, and it's the first time I can remember being... I think I'd always enjoyed storytelling, but it's the first time I remember being really excited at the idea that you could step out of your everyday life into something completely magical and fantastical, and the excitement of being able to explore and discover each new world, because you never knew what the characters were going to find when they went up the tree through the clouds into whichever magical world happened to be there in whichever chapter, so that you always got to have the pleasure of exploring it and finding out the rules of each new world and how it worked, until something inevitably went wrong and the children found themselves in some sort of predicament that they had to solve. And I borrowed I stole, let's face it, I stole unashamedly from that for the Train to Impossible Places, because every time Susie steps off the train, she's in a new magical world and we get to explore it with her, and it's all about pushing the world a bit further and finding out the limits and the new rules, and it's always slightly different each time. So it's like a little bit like unwrapping a Christmas present each time Susie steps off the train.
All right. Okay. It's interesting what Peter said there about I stole. There is a wonderful children's writer in America named Richard Peck. And Richard Peck says, "We write by the light of every book we have ever read or that has ever been read to us." So I agree, sometimes I feel like I'm stealing, but actually I think what we're doing is absorbing and letting it grow into something that is within us, something we empathize with, something that touches us profoundly, something that pulls us onto a journey, and we go with it. And maybe we don't understand exactly where it is all coming from, but we trust it. The authors and illustrators are on a journey as much as the readers are on a journey. I work, I think, in a very complimentary and sympathetic way to what others have been describing here. I do some fantastical stuff, but what I want to look at is historical fiction. I will take a person and a place and a time that is other than anything I know. I haven't met this person. I haven't been in that time and place. And I will learn as much as I can about it. And then I will start out finding my story in that world. It's a tricky thing because in America these days, there is a very important move to not tell the same stories from the same perspective that we've had for decades. But instead, let's look at the experiences of a very mixed culture and let's honor our diversity. Part of that is this idea that if a story is set in India, it belongs to someone of Indian descent. If a story is set in China, it belongs to someone of Chinese descent. It's very interesting what you feel, what you think about that. As a writer, I believe that human beings are human beings and that I can try to understand another person, another place, another time. It may be more work for me to understand 1380 in the north of China, but even somebody living in the north of China, in the Shaanxi province today, is going to have to do a lot of research to know what was going on in 1380. We all, when we approach a story, we all have things we have to learn. Even when we're creating a world, we have to make sure that the world that we're creating is internally coherent, because our reader is going to test it. Any reader that finds an incoherence, that finds an inconsistency, loses trust in the writer. And then why read the story? They always say one of the rules of writing is write, show, don't tell. And I believe the reason they say that is that if you show somebody something, well, then they believe it. They saw it. If you tell somebody something, why should they believe it? Who are you? So your job as a writer is to gain their trust. Make them see right off that this character is suffering. Don't say she's suffering. Let them see that tear down the side, or the way that her leg is shaking when she has to work to keep it in place when she's talking to this person who is frightening her. Let them see it, and then they believe it. So this whole thing of trusting and where are you going and what are you allowed to write about and what do you know about is really tricky. As an artist, as a writer, I need to write about someone other than me. If I were to write my story, well, then I'd write it and it would be done. But I don't want to write just one story, and I'm not that interested in me. I'm not that interesting a person. I want to tell a story. I want to craft it. And so we put ourselves, we empathize, we let that guy's experience become ours. We let us be profoundly affected by that guy that we see. We let ourselves take the journey and we create. And that, I think we couldn't write historical fiction at all if we really stuck to the idea of you have to have experienced it in order to understand it. And actually, while I think There is a lot to be said for having diverse voices. We want diverse voices. We need diverse voices. It is very important for us to understand that we're all human. We're going to understand each other if we try hard enough, or at least I think we are. Are there things you all want to say at this point?
I just want to add to what you said because I find it very interesting when you say, imbibing a story and making it your own or putting yourself as a part of it. I think in my practice and in my years of, it's been a sort of journey. I think illustration has always been a journey. But I've realized the importance of being able to take your experiences that you have and create your stories around it. You create your narratives around it because I do also believe it is very important to tell your story in whichever way, to whichever audience you're choosing. So you can take an experience you had and treat it in any way you like in order for different levels of people or different age groups to understand it. But I think, and what fascinates me about this element of storytelling is that everyone would have actually felt, you feel the same set of emotions. You might react differently to them, you might express them differently, but it's the same set of emotions. So that's the sort of the joy of storytelling, isn't it? I mean, the power of storytelling as well, where I can communicate with someone who might not be from my culture, who might not be from a geography anywhere near mine, and I've never met them, but they can still empathize with what it is I've chosen to narrate. So, yeah.
I'd agree. I think emotional honesty is key in all storytelling. Susie, my main character, is an 11-year-old girl, 11-year-old mixed-race girl, which I've never been, obviously. But so obviously I can't speak with any sort of authority beyond my own experience, but what I can do is put emotional honesty into her journey through the book, and I think that's key, and that's what will reach across all sorts of social and cultural boundaries.
Sometimes what triggers...
Is that working?
Sometimes what triggers my ideas are inexplicable because I'm a dreamer, and I've been chronicling my dreams for the last 30 years, but sometimes I'm shown things like points of view from flying or buildings that I would never have ever imagined in my waking state, or characters, subaquatic characters, which walking around, which I don't see when I'm in my waking state, So how can I explain that? But then those characters do make their way into all those kinds of colossal structures or those points of view, apart from me flying over physically in a plane, but sometimes I'm actually seeing it in dream state, and it definitely feeds into my work, and that is, I can't explain, but it's part of the triggering of imagination and ideas and stories.
One of the things that has been coming up here is emotions and emotional honesty. I do an exercise with very young children where I'll ask them, think of a book that you have read or that has been read to you within this school year that you really, really want your best friend to read. And now, tell me why. And what they will say is, because it will make her laugh, because it will make her cry, because it will scare her, because she won't be able to figure it out. And all the things that they list are emotions. If we want to find out what sharks do, we go to the nonfiction part of the library. If we want to be frightened by sharks, we go to the fiction part of the library. We read fiction in order to have an emotional ride. And as long as that emotional ride is honest, we should be able to take any human being on it. That is our hope, at least. We have a few minutes left, and we did want to give you some time to ask us whatever you'd like to ask us.
So it was a wonderful session, and my question is, as readers, we believe in imagination and we start living in that. But when reality strikes us, it's the time when we, feel disoriented. We start feeling, oh, I read it like that, I believed it like that, but it is not like that. So how, as authors, what is the responsibility to, bring that balance for a reader?
It's a very difficult one. I've never quite subscribed to the answer that reading and fantasy is simply escapism, because that sounds slightly cowardly or slightly, I don't know, as long as you're escaping to something as opposed to escaping from something, I think that can be healthy. But the whole purpose of imagination is not to tell you how it is, but how it could be. So I think it can all good storytelling and fantasy can be aspirational, just to show you. And again, going back to the emotional honesty thing that we were discussing, it can tell you how best to react to situations that you haven't been put in yourself. So when something similar does come along, you have a grounding or a reference point. Even if you don't actually react like that yourself, you have a point of reference by which to navigate through the situation you find yourself in. And the more perspectives you can read about and gain through your reading, I think the better map you have to navigate the situations that you find yourself in.
And I have a complete intolerance for books about war for children in which no one you love dies. I think that is a hateful lie, and I think lies to children are unforgivable. It is really important that writers be honest, but that does not mean that writers should be hopeless. I think that one of the responsibilities of writing for children, which is very different from writing for adults, one of the responsibilities is that children believe you, and you must leave a child with a sense of hope. Maybe the child cannot change the situation they are in. Children are often the least powerful actors in a given situation. But it is important to leave the child with the sense that everyone can live decently if only within their heads.